Everyone has moved on from Gaza to Iran. And so before we entirely forget about Gaza, I wanted to close the loop on a question that got a lot of loud answers, but almost no serious analysis. Was what happened in Gaza a genocide? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a Middle East scholar. So why am I even asking this? Because over the past 2.5 years, I watched millions of people confidently declare that what was happening in Gaza was genocide. On streets, on campuses, on social media. Not as a legal question, but as an obvious fact, beyond debate, driven by intuition. And when I looked at what most of them were actually basing their conclusion on, I found very little. Powerful images, horrifying numbers, moral outrage, but almost no engagement with what the word actually means, what the legal standard requires, or what the evidence does and does not show. That is why, about 2.5 years ago, I said that this wasn't a genocide in one of my videos. But much has happened since then. Now we have a ceasefire, completed hostage negotiations, peer-reviewed casualty research, and a clearer picture of what actually happened. So I want to check whether that conclusion still holds, not because I feel pressure to change it, but because I want to close the topic before everyone moves on entirely. The word gets used constantly in this conflict, so let's start with the actual legal definition. Genocide comes from the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. It means committing violent acts with a specific intent to destroy a group, in whole or in part, as a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Two elements must both be present: the act and the specific intent to destroy the group as a group. That means high death tolls or brutality alone are not sufficient. Collective punishment, even if confirmed, does not constitute genocide under international law either. You need documented intent, the physical destruction of this people as a people. So where does the legal record currently stand? The International Court of Justice has not made a ruling yet. It issued provisional measures in January 2024, which required Israel to prevent genocidal acts, ensure humanitarian access, and preserve evidence. But those measures were designed to mitigate genocide and allow an investigation. They were not a legal determination that genocide is occurring. The actual legal case is ongoing and a final ruling is realistically years away. The UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry released a report in September 2025 concluding that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. However, the commission is an investigative body, not a judicial tribunal. Its findings are politically significant, but legally non-binding. And given the UN's documented institutional record on Israel, I'd be cautious blindly accepting it as objective, something I cover in more depth in another episode. On casualties. A peer-reviewed study in the Lancet Global Health, based on an independent survey of nearly 10,000 people, estimated approximately 75,000 violent deaths by early January 2025. Neither Hamas nor Israeli authorities seriously disagreed with this figure. Independent analysis estimates the civilian share at between 61 and 80%, a range that is also broadly uncontested. What is generally debated is how many of those civilian deaths represent innocent victims, given documented civilian participation in the October 7th attacks and significant survey evidence of civilian support for Hamas. The central question in a genocide case is not how many people died. It is whether there is evidence of specific intent to destroy Palestinians as a group. Based on the current evidence, I don't think that threshold is met. And again, I don't claim to be a legal expert, but I do claim that my reasoning is a bit more substantiated than the many protesters, graffiti sprayers, NGOs, and activists I've seen shout about genocide. So here are my reasons why I don't think this was a genocide. First, how Israel fought the war. If Israel's goal were the physical extermination of Palestinians as a people, the rational military strategy would be bombardment with no ground campaign. Instead, Israel sent ground troops into Gaza in large numbers, a campaign that cost over 900 Israeli soldiers their lives, in some of the most costly urban combat Israel has fought in decades. This doesn't look like an extermination strategy. Israel also issued tens of thousands of evacuation notices throughout the campaign, via leaflets, phone calls, and broadcast warnings, directing civilians away from strike zones. There is evidence that these warnings were imperfect. Some directed people toward areas that were subsequently struck. Some gave inadequate time to evacuate. Those failures will be part of any war crimes investigation. But systematically warning people seems inconsistent with trying to kill them all. Rules of engagement were significantly loosened, and some Israeli political and military figures made statements that were alarming, including references to making Gaza uninhabitable. But aggressive statements from individual officials do not, by themselves, establish state-level genocidal intent. Courts look at the totality of policy and conduct, not the worst statements from the most extreme voices. Second, the negotiation record. The October 2025 ceasefire resulted in the release of all remaining living hostages taken on October 7th, an end of major military operations, and a transitional governance framework for Gaza involving international oversight and a plan toward a reformed Palestinian Authority. These are the actions of a state pursuing defined military and political objectives, however harshly they may be implemented, not of a state conducting genocide. Third, the broader Palestinian citizen context. Approximately 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian Arabs. They vote, serve in the parliament, sit on courts, and are protected under Israeli law. That reality has been maintained for 75 years, alongside contested and at times harsh policies in the occupied territories. The combination does not fit the profile of a state whose overarching project is the physical elimination of Palestinians as a people. Those are my reasons. But I want to take the opposing case seriously too, so let me address the 5 most common arguments I've heard for genocide and why none of them hold up. The first argument, the scale of death and destruction prove genocidal intent. This is, of course, the most emotionally powerful argument, and the numbers are real. Roughly 75,000 violent deaths, widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, displacement of the majority of Gaza's population. The problem is that scale alone cannot establish genocide legally or logically. The Allied firebombing of Dresden, the destruction of Mosul during the campaign against ISIS, the Russian campaign in Aleppo, all produce comparable or worse outcomes in dense urban environments. The relevant question is not whether the death toll is horrifying, but whether the deaths were the instrument of a project to destroy a people as such. Gaza had a documented military rationale, destroying Hamas's command and tunnel infrastructure, much of which was deliberately embedded beneath civilian buildings and hospitals throughout the Strip. That won't explain or excuse every strike, but it explains the strategy. The second argument, the majority of deaths were women and children, so they must have been targeted. The Lancet study found that 56% of violent deaths were women, children, or elderly. That figure was widely cited as evidence of deliberate targeting. Here's the problem with that interpretation. Gaza has a very young population, and roughly half of any population is women. So, as a matter of logic, civilian deaths resulting from untargeted bombing in an area with this demographic will naturally produce deaths with similar shares. What the Lancet data actually shows is casualties consistent with Gaza's civilian population composition. This is evidence of untargeted bombing and insufficient protection of civilians, but it is not evidence of systematic targeting. The third argument. Israeli ministers openly discussed mass displacement, proving eliminatory intent. Several senior Israeli officials, including cabinet ministers, made statements in the early months of the war that explicitly discussed encouraging or engineering the mass displacement of Gaza's population. Some of these statements were extraordinary, and I don't want to minimize them. But statements from individual officials, particularly from the political extremes within a coalition government, are not equivalent to state policy. The actual governance framework after the war went in the opposite direction from displacement as policy. The authority structure, the hostage for ceasefire negotiations, and the international oversight mechanism all point elsewhere. Statements and actions did not match. And I think it's the actions that matter. The fourth argument: blocking aid was a form of genocide. There is substantial evidence that restrictions on aid led to famine conditions in parts of Gaza during periods of the conflict. If confirmed by independent investigation, deliberately using starvation as a weapon of war is a crime under international humanitarian law and may constitute a crime against humanity. But deliberately causing suffering to extract political or military concessions, as harsh as that is legally different from intending to destroy a people as a group. The test under the Genocide Convention is whether this deprivation was designed to cause the physical destruction of the group as such, not merely to weaken or pressure it. Whether that threshold is met in Gaza is uncertain. The fifth argument: there was no rational military goal, so the destruction must have been genocide. This argument was widely made in the first year of the war, when Israel's plan for Gaza after the fighting was unclear. It has weakened significantly since, and it was always built on a false premise. The war was not unprovoked destruction in search of a justification. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, killing 1,200 people, taking 251 hostages, and deliberately targeting civilians at the Nova Music Festival and the surrounding kibbutzim. Hamas' own communications made clear the attack was designed to maximize civilian deaths. Israel's military response had a concrete, documented objective: destroy Hamas' military capacity and retrieve the hostages. That is not the logic of a genocide. It is the logic of a state that was attacked and responded. And the response achieved its stated goals. Hamas' military capacity was significantly weakened. All living hostages were eventually released, and a transitional governance framework was established. That framework is fragile, but its existence removes the foundation of the no rational purpose argument entirely. So where does this leave us? I cannot deliver a final legal verdict. The ICJ case will run for years. But based on the totality of evidence available now, the conduct of the ground campaign, the negotiation record, the governance framework that emerged, I find it unlikely that international courts will ultimately rule the war in Gaza genocide as legally defined. War crimes and crimes against humanity cannot be ruled out, and some will likely face legal scrutiny. But the specific intent to destroy Palestinians as a people is not what the evidence currently shows. What it shows is a war that did not prioritize civilian life, with probable criminal conduct on specific targeting decisions, against an enemy that deliberately maximized civilian exposure as a strategic choice. That is terrible enough on its own terms. It does not need a label the evidence cannot support. There is one further irony worth noting. The organization whose conduct in this conflict most closely fits the legal definition of genocidal intent has attracted remarkably little of the genocide framing that dominated Western debate. Hamas explicitly calls for the elimination of Jews in its founding charter, designed its October 7th attack to kill as many Jewish civilians as possible, choosing a music festival as its primary target precisely because it was full of unarmed young people, and then use its own population as a shield to ensure Israel would be blamed for the casualties that followed. That asymmetry doesn't change my assessment of Israel's conduct, but it does raise a question worth sitting with. Why does the word attach so readily in one direction and not the other? That's a question for the next episode.